Let me briefly introduce Marçal. So that is, of course, kind of a few words about your academic background. Yeah. Marçal is an associate professor of history at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And he's a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, a member of the board of directors of the Lusophone Studies Association, which is, I think, based in York, at the York University in Canada, and an associate researcher at the CEIS 20 Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at the Complexities University. And his main research interests include the contemporary history of Portuguese-speaking African countries, well, PALOP countries, so to speak, East Timor and Portugal, with a special focus on anti-colonial networks in the Lusophone world in the global Cold War. Among his recent publications, I would like to mention a very interesting. No, I shouldn't say that because it's published in my book. fantastic article. The contemporary history of Angola in Brazil, pluralist past within a modern nation, or the Canadian abroad left and the anti-colonial struggle at home and abroad, the case of the Toronto Committee for the Liberation of Portugal's African colonies. And well, today, of course, this is your topic, the Lusophone world, and that is very, for the cluster, it's fantastic, it's very interesting. And maybe I can bring you together, probably you know them, together with the research group that we have here at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History, Raquel Sirotti and her group, because she has more or less the same constellation. She is Brazilian, and then she has a doctoral student from Angola and one from Mozambique. It's a very interesting group. That's why I would like to bring to bring it together. And well, today we hear something about Palimpsests and puzzles, reimagining Angola's history 50 years after the independence. And Marçal, again, I'm very happy that you're here at the floor. It's yours.
Thank you so much, Stefan. For me, it's a real pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I don't speak German, so I have to read in English, okay? Dear colleagues and friends, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak at this research center on the 50th anniversary of Angola's independence. As we know, anniversaries in historical terms typically tend to be dull and political biased, with just celebratory narratives, but I won't follow this path today. Angola's past, its longue durée, its fractures, its resistance and reconfigurations does not fit easily within a conventional and straightforward commemorative line. I want to open this lecture by inviting you to rethink Angola through two concepts, the palimpsest and the puzzle. These concepts emerge from a simple observation. Angola's history is neither singular nor linear. It's an hermeneutic space where multiple temporalities coexist, some visible, others nearly erased, some imposed from outside, others deeply rooted in local experience. And yet, for decades, both external and internal readings of Angola have tended to flatten this complexity. From the outside, Angola has often been imagined through a narrow set of cliches: war, oil, diamonds, corruptions, heroic liberation, or exoticized culture. Even the scholarship of the Atlantic slave trade, indispensable as it is, has been mainly guided by diasporic frameworks and politics centered on the North and South Americas. These perspectives have unintentionally obscured the internal dynamics that shaped Angola society long before and far beyond the Atlantic world, including necessarily the horrendous commerce of human beings. From the inside, however, the tendency has not been entirely different. After independence and intensified during the Civil War, the past became a powerful political tool. A cohesive national narrative emerged, heroic, linear, and stable. But it did so at the cost of silencing differences. regional history, historic histories, alternative political trajectories, local experience of violence, women stories, generation memories, and uneven rhythms of life across the country. In this process, notions such as freedom, liberation, and independence were standardized, aligned with the state elite's vision, and often disconnected from the lived reality of many Angolans. As a matter of fact, my proposal of reading Angola's history does not stray from the reflections made by Joseph Miller, to whom I also pay my tribute in this lecture. In his majestic work, Way of Death, published in 1988, he constantly reminds us of the need for an eclectic, theoretical, and methodological approach to avoid diminishing Angola's rich history. John Miller viewed Angola not as a passive edge of European empires, but as a lively center of African political innovation. In his view, Angolan societies had developed intricate systems of authority, kinship, and warfare that predated the Portuguese arrival. Instead of seeing colonial influence as a straightforward process, Miller aimed to reconstruct African society by highlighting multiple motivations and timelines. He pointed out that political power in Angola was historically based on adaptable networks of kinship and loyalty, constantly shaped by conflict, movement, and ritual authority. This internal energy, rather than European actions, was the main driver of historical change. In his key work, Angola is linked to Portugal and Brazil in a layered web of historical elements seen through many valid perspectives and conflicting viewpoints. For him, understanding Angola's history requires considerations of ecology, African belief systems, societal structures, and both micro and macroeconomy. In Miller's interpretation, the Atlantic slave trade must be understood through African political logics, not merely as a European economic imposition, nor as an echo of the standardized political mindset that divides history between the global North and the global South. In his work, he demonstrates that the trade of captives grew out of Angola's own systems of dependency, patronage, and warfare. For Miller, Angolan rulers and war leaders pursued captives not only to meet European demand, but also to fulfill local needs for followers, workers, and ritual dependents. This perspective challenged Eurocentric narratives that depicted Africans as victims without agency, while also avoiding romanticized interpretations of African power. To him, and I quote, "History transmoved in different paces," end of quotation. Miller's interpretation of history reveals how Angolans, enduring over centuries, adapting to new pressures and reconfiguring their internal logics. That's how he links pre-colonial, colonial, and even post-colonial periods, framing the country as a palimpsest of overlapping historical layers and asymmetrical dependencies. In short, he shows how, and I quote, "Old ideas in Africa accommodated far-reaching and novel changes in behavior with resiliency, explaining that the decline of old policies based on keeping people as dependents and the rise of a new type of state that thrived on enslaving some and selling others abroad." Ultimately, Miller's regarded Angola as a space where global and local forces constantly intersected, but where African agency remained essential. His work continues to influence historians who aim to understand Angola not as a projection of the Atlantic system, but as a historical world in its own right. This is where, how, and why the concepts of palimpsest and puzzle are useful to reimagine Angola's past. The palimpsests remind us that history is made of layers. In Angola, the traces of early political cultures, economic networks, social structures, and cosmologies were never completely eradicated by colonial rule, war, or even by the post-2002 reconstruction of the country. They remain visible, sometimes faintly, sometimes vividly, beneath the newer inscriptions of the state, of the global capital, or the modern urban life. The puzzle, in turn, reminds us that these layers don't align perfectly. Angola's past consists of fragments, scattered sources, conflicting memories, contradictory narratives, and sudden shifts in scale, from the village to the empire, from the hut to the skyline, from the local to the global. Our task isn't to force these pieces into a single coherent picture, but to understand what each piece reveals, what it hides, and how they interact in tension. This lecture defends that rethinking Angola's history is more than an academic exercise. It's a cultural and political responsibility. By exploring the layers and fragments of the past, its palimpsests and puzzles, we can discover new ways to understand freedom, belonging, and historical accountability today. Let me present you the Luanda's palimpsest. In this section, I want to highlight Luanda as a city palimpsest. This does not mean a Luanda-centric view of Angola. Conversely, I intend to emphasize several historical layers of the city through various depictions from diverse historical sources that showcase the city via 6 metaphors: the city fortress and a slave port, the city of Kitanda Market, the city of Varandas, the city of Musekes, the city in wooden crates, and the city of light and dust. Viewing Luanda through these metaphors remind us of Reinhard Koselleck's lessons in history and theory. According to his Begriffsgeschichte, sorry for my German pronunciation, is it through the remaining concepts of the past that we perceive the time-changing history. Analyzing those 6 metaphors of Luanda allow us to examine how asymmetrical dependence have existed over time, and to interpret them within specific time frames and social context. First metaphor, the city fortress and the slave port. Antônio de Oliveira Cadornega presents us the city fortress. He was a Portuguese soldier and administrator with Jewish New Christian roots who spent 4 decades in Angola during the 17th century. He was the author of História Geral das Guerras Angolanas, a monumental 3-volume chronicle that details the Portuguese expansion, warfare, diplomacy, and daily life in Angola in the middle of the 17th century, nearly the period when the city was founded by Paulo de Dias de Novaes under the name of São Paulo da Assunção de Luanda, near the Cuanza River. From this general history of the Angolan's war, I quote, "At Luanda lies the pleasant port, which being so capable and safe from the battles of the waves and the fury of the winds, which was chosen by the ancient and first conqueror Paulo Dias de Novaes as a refuge and shelter for our ships, and being capable of accommodating many fleets, a quiet port from the fury of the sea and wind." And I'm still quoting him when I say, we say more about this coast than the news given to us by navigators who go those parts in their passages and vessels to rescue and trade slaves and ivory. Tacula, it's a type of wood, and libongos, a cloth. Both those that are circulate for currency and those that are craft, which they say came from the kingdom of Luango and Majombe and from São Tomé. It's noteworthy to remember that this was only from this slave port in Luanda that at least more than 3 million of captives were sold mainly to Brazil. However, history never stops, and Luanda offers a good perspectives of the transformed atmosphere after the prohibition of the slave trade in the middle of the 19th century. A picture of this period was captured in the descriptions of George Thames, the German physician who visited Luanda around 1840. Here, the second metaphor emerges, the city Kitanda market, and I quote George Thames. These markets, imitating fairs, were excessively picturesque. In each of these tents, a beautiful black woman would appear every morning and arrange in the best order her various portions of mats, baskets, scissors, knives, cloths, and pipes, etc. But they evidently relied on their beauty as a sufficient attractions for their customers. In the afternoon, they would dismantle these small tents and form even smaller ones in different places, where they often used to stay overnight. Fruits and vegetables were also found in great abundance in these two markets, and with the exception of potatoes, which were replaced by yams and bananas, almost every kind of European vegetable could be bought here. On the other hand, vendors seated among the stalls tried to induce visitors to buy their red tomato soup, which they offered in large earthenware vessels and in coconuts cut in half. And although this soup wasn't very appetizing, it had a pleasant, very refreshing acidity, and it quenched thirst. As the historian José Curto has demonstrated, the slave trade played a structural role in Luanda's demography. As the slave port economy collapsed, locally born Africans, Afro-Portuguese families, freed people, and migrants from the interior became increasingly central to the city's population profile, contributing to a growing creolized urban society. Curto demonstrates that new demographic rhythms emerged as Luanda adapted to new economic and social realities. The city welcomed several workers, including skilled craftsmen such as showmakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, watchmakers, and barkers. In short, in the middle of the 19th century, the end of the slave trade shifted the great slave city port into a more complex economic environment. No more selling slaves, but taking them to reform its urban atmosphere. This urban look is well described by Joaquim John Monteiro, the naturalist born in the Madeira Islands who served as a British colonial officer. His two-volume work, Angola and River Congo, published in 1875, describes how Luanda underwent significant change in the middle of the 19th century. Here, the city of Varandas comes into view, which is the third metaphor. Luanda contains about 10,000 or 12,000 inhabitants, and I quote him, of whom about 1/3 are whites. The houses are generally large and commodious, built of stone and roofed with red tiles. Blue is a favorite color for painting windowsills, door spots, etc., and gives a very pretty appearance to the city. The greater part of the houses consists only of a ground floor. The better class have a first, but rarely second floor. Verandas, more or less open, are the rule, in which it is customary to take meals. The slavers on their way out to Luanda used to bring timber from Rio de Janeiro for the rafters and flooring of the houses. And so hard and durable was it that it can be seen at the present day in the old buildings as perfect and sound as when first put down, resisting perfectly to the white ant, beetle larvae, dry rot, and mildew would soon attack and destroy native woods. Luanda has improved immensely since I first landed there in February 1858. It was then a very dilapidated and abandoned condition. His depiction of, end of quotation, his depiction of Luanda was written after Brazil's independence in 1822 and after the prohibition of the slave trade in the South Atlantic. Monteiro's picture of Luanda relates to another account from Britain written by Mary Kingsley a travel white writer and naturalist who visited Luanda in 1899. To her, this city had beautiful palm-lined streets and was lit by lamps that burned peanut oil, despite a poor water supply and lots of garbage on the streets. At the end of the 19th century, Luanda was a complex city, blending fascinating and problematic urban elements. As we know, the struggles over geopolitics in Europe reshaped African borders in a rampant competition for power and power dominance. Fearing losing Angola to France, England, or Germany, Portugal would wage their actual colonial conquest. This process reshaped the city once again, transforming Luanda into a core of the colonial power. It was there that Portugal attempted to create, and I quote, new Brazils in Africa, aiming to turn its slave trade past business into a plantation-based economy. To achieve this goal and defend its presumed rights of dominance, Portugal initiated several military expeditions to conquer and, in some sense, to make Angola in its actual size, grasping different regions in the upper north of Cabinda, in the hinterland of the Lunda region, and in the deep south of Cunene. In the era of the Berlin Conference, and between the Belgian Congo and the Deutsche Südwest Africa, it was vital to demonstrate that all those distinct Angolans were subjects of the same Portuguese empire. In this context, Luanda served as an administrative hub and a military stronghold, leading the occupation process and adding new pieces to the puzzle, as I will analyze further. People have always found ways to resist, and with resilient creativity, they persist despite despotism. Subdued by the colonial power, Angolans have gutted and swallowed the Portuguese language, recreating it as their own way of communication, inserting new words and new cosmologies. Nobody exemplifies this cultural kind of resistance better than Luandino Vieira. He was a member of the MPLA, one of the anti-colonial power movements that fought against Portuguese colonialism. His short story collection, titled Luanda, with the W, signifies a native appropriation of the colonizer's language. Vieira incorporated many Kimbundu words into his work, giving his literature an unmistakable Angolan accent. Not surprisingly, his book was banned and he got imprisoned. His narrative subverted metropolitan prose to denounce the precarious life of the poor colonized subject. And here we see another metaphor, the Luanda of Musekes. I quote Luandino Vieira. In that way, it rained for a long time, and only around midday did it begin to calm down, even though the sky was still wide open and ugly, all black with clouds, and had not yet poured out their water. The Museki at that hour looked like a senzala in the middle of a lagoon. The rain itself was the streets. The Kubata were invaded by the red, dirty water rushing quickly, heading towards these asphalt roads that lead downtown, or stubbornly stayed behind to form cacimbas, puddles where mosquitoes would be born and frogs croak. There were even cubatas that had collapsed, and the people, so as not to die in vain, were out in the streets with the imbambas that they had managed to save. End of quotation. Angola's political independence was a monumental achievement. It was a victory achieved by many contributors. It included the simple peasant who refused, boycotted, and fled from forced labor on cotton, diamond, coffee, or other colonial export crop plantations. It also involved the various political movements divided by different ideological projects, internal alliance, and external geopolitical interests. They do not rely solely on weapons to fight. They also engage in political diplomacy to influence and persuade international public opinion, lecturing on global politics and arguing that Portuguese colonialism was a crime against humanity. Social movements in Western countries recognize this perception, as the United Nations, the Pope, and ultimately even the Portuguese army itself did. It was then time to end Europe's longest lasting colonial presence in Africa, dismantling also the last fascist dictatorship in Europe. After the Carnation Revolution on April 25, 1974, not only did Salazarism end in Portugal, but Portuguese colonialism also ceased in Africa. And I do not exaggerate when I say this: everything began in Angola. The transfer of power and independence itself gathers many layers of political complexities. One of them concerns of the fate of the white Portuguese settlers, their business, and the presence of many white Angolans. This political turbulence reveals Luanda as a city of wooden crates, the 60th metaphor. This image came from the Polish journalist and author Ryszard Kapuscinski, who covered the independence of Angola as at its best. In his Another Day of Life, he mixed journalism with literature, giving us a chronicle from the chaotic times, a few days before the independence of Angola on November 11th, 1975. The city in wooden crates is a stunning image of the Portuguese settlers and white Luso-Angolans with their families trying to escape from Luanda, packing and shaping their belongings back to Lisbon. And I quote Kapuscinski: "Everybody was busy building crates. Mountains of boards and plywood were brought in. The price of hammers and nails soared. Crates were main topic of conversation: how to build them, what was the best thing to reinforce them with. Self-proclaimed experts, crate specialists, homegrown architects of cratery, masters of crate styles, crate schools, and crate fashions appeared. Inside the Luanda of concrete and bricks, a new wooden city began to rise. The streets I walk through resemble a great building site. I stumble over discarded planks. Nails sticking out of beams ripped my shirt. Some crates were as big as vacation cottages because a hierarchy of crate status had suddenly come into being. The richer the people, the bigger the crates they erected." End of quotation. In Kapuscinski's picture, Luanda is depicted in transition to political power, in a hurry and deeply entangled in Cold War politics at the start of the horrendous Civil War. This is a city at a pivotal moment in African decolonization, showing how Angola's independence sparked a massive migration of white families from Luanda to other countries around the world, including Portugal, South Africa, Canada, and Brazil. This means that many memoirs from that period still exist in these countries. And these layers of this past were waiting to be better studied, by the way. For some, it might be challenging to admit that Angola's political trauma and collective memory are more closely connected to the Civil War rather than the 3-century history of the slave trade. In fact, Angola experienced a fratricidal war from 1975 to 2002, and the scars are evident across various parts of the country. During the Civil War, Luanda played another role. It served as the base for MPLA's one-party rule. It was where Cubans, Soviets, Vietnamese, Yugoslavs, and many Western collaborators first gathered to assist in the fight against UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi. It also stood at the cornerstone and of a project to develop an African socialist model, initially led by Agostinho Neto and later by José Eduardo dos Santos. Paradoxically, this socialist project was funded by global oil exports and a military bureaucracy that maintained a highly hierarchical relationship between the state and society. In such an environment, a different Rwanda emerged, marked by stark wealth and power disparities. And the final metaphor appears now, following the novels by Onjaki and Pepetela, two Angolan writers who highlight the new contradictions that sparkled on the streets of Rwanda, which became the city of light and dust in its beauty and precarity. Portraying the Mayanga district of Rwanda in the city's high, Onjaki focuses on the lives of ordinary residents in a collapsing apartment building. I quote his novel, The Transparent, published in 2013 after the end of the Civil War. Rwanda was the city of dust and light, where the building seemed to dissolve into the air, and the voices of its people carried through the streets like echoes of resilience. End of quotation. The same city of dream and ruins developed a consistent ideological structure, mingling political engagement with political subservience as a strategic way to survive amid layers of asymmetries that do not align across political leaflets and ministerial discourses. This political ambience also appears in Pepetela's novel entitled The Predators, which I quote. On the streets, there was a political parade with many cars full of people waving red and black flags and holding placards, young people in red t-shirts with raised fists, shouting slogans and political songs. The elections were 1 week away. These parades of people perched on cars, dozens of flag-draped cars honking, and hundreds of citizens shouting the people in their learning process under the newly arrived democracy, called carreatas, since passeatas should be used only for demonstrations done by foot. This was perhaps the largest concentration of vehicles ever, most of them belonging to state property, noisily blaring their horns. End of quotation. And at some point in Pepetela's novel, he interrupts the narrative fluency to bluntly address his allusive reader about the structures of the book, saying, and I quote, "And the reader, who is used to reading more than one book per decade, is probably thinking at this moment, right, here comes a flashback to explain where this Vladimiro Caposso comes from and how he became what he is today. Disclose yourself of the idea. There will be explanations, of course, but not now. I still have the breath for a few more pages without turning back in the story, while trying to read history. And let me warn you from the start, this is not a detective novel, although it does deal with quite a few sons of a bitch. Let me also warn you that there will be many shifts in time. We will not remain focused on the year 1992, when the first elections took place. We will go backwards and forwards, but only when I feel like it, and not when readers might expect it, because that kind of democracy, the one that gives a voice to the reader, has already sent a person to hell and many of books to the rubbish bin." End of quotation. This is a thought-provoking way to conclude this section. Pepetela's narrative reminds us that the fluctuating nature of the time, and why we must never forget the social life does not easily fit into a triumphant story. Where human beings are involved, power, interest, and calculations also come into play. and that includes Angola, naturally. So the second part of this lecture is about the Angola's puzzle. This part will be less extensive but crucial because it showcases Angola's history using the puzzle as a key concept. Many phases in Angola's history exemplify different social backgrounds, distinct cosmogonies, ethnicities, and cultures. The Portuguese colonialism did not conquer all of Angola at the same time or in the same way. It is accurate to say that the northern region of the Congo and Luanda, areas inhabited by the Bakongo and Mbundu peoples, came under Portuguese rule from the 16th century, and this historical process is closely linked to the slave trade. Queen Zinga Imbandi is the most prominent figure in this process. She is known from the writings of the Antônio de Oliveira Cadornega, previously mentioned today. Here, one piece of the puzzle fits into its layer from the Palimpsests. The same structure applies to Benguela, a city slave port founded in the early decades of the 17th century. However, this match does not fit as well as in other regions. There, the chronological markers begin to change as we move into the internet. In the highlights of Uambo and Bié, the area of the Ovimbundu people, the pressure from the slave trade began in the late 18th century. Still, the Portuguese did not conquer the kingdoms of Uambo, Bié, and Bailundu. They remained politically independent until the beginning of the 20th century, after the so-called Bailundu War in 1902. It is remarkable that during the colonial conquest, the Portuguese were aided by North Americans and Canadian missionaries. They even arrived at the region before the military occupation. From these pieces of the puzzle, the hero of the resistance is known as King Equiqui II, in the center of the picture, whose only known picture was discovered in the archive in Toronto, Canada, 20 years in the 21st century already. After that moment, colonialism began and an effective occupation took place, including the foundation of Nova Lisboa, present-day Uambo, in 1912, just a couple of years before World War I. Consequently, in a context so totally different from the slave trade. Yet again, we do need to draw conclusions from this evidence. One might be that the length of the Portuguese domination varies across region, each piece of the country, of the puzzle. In the deep south of Angola, around the same time, we perceive the same time lapse. Until the early 20th century, this region, mainly inhabited by the Ovambo people, remained independent with various ethnic groups, including the Nyaneka-Umbe, the Kwanyamas, the Kuvales, the Herero, and many others. For example, the current areas of Huila and Cunene provinces were only subdued during the World War I, specifically in 1917, when the young King Mandumunyan de Mufayo was killed during a conflict against the Portuguese military occupation, the third one, on the right side. The King Mandumi refused to surrender, mobilizing an entire army that used native weapons like spears, along with German Mauser rifles, which they captured after battles against Germans who were around at the time. It's notable that Portugal's conquest of southern Angola has many connections with World War I battles in the region, especially when Germany lost its Southwest African colony, now Namibia, to the Union of South Africa, which was under British rule at the time. It's also important to note that the border between Namibia and the northern Namibia and the southern Angola was drawn during this period, dividing many Ovambo people. These events were complicated by the presence of Lutheran missionaries in the region, Germans as well as Finns, who competed against the Catholic Portuguese, who after these wars were able to expand their work in the area. I think we have enough of historical examples, and let's go to final remarks. Angola is a vast country that is often unappreciated. Some academic linguistic surveys say that there are more than 30 different languages existing in Angola. And within each of them, dialects and cultural hybridism persist, provoked by a continuous process of internal migration through the slave trade, the colonial and the anti-colonial driving forces, the civil war displacement, and so on. Here, we should not forget the palimpsests, principally because it exists in every part of the puzzle, giving historical layers to cultural pieces, somehow adapting and challenging the narrative of the one-party system ideology of one nation, one people, from Cabinda to Cunene. In terms of size, Angola has the combined area of Germany, France, and United Kingdom. It is 14 times larger than the former colonial ruler, Portugal. Luanda alone has about 8 million residents in its metropolitan area, accounting for nearly a quarter of the country's total population of 39 million. Although Angola has a low overall population density, Luanda's density is comparable to that of London and 3 times that of Berlin, for example. You know why? Because of the tragedy of the civil war that forced many people from their hometowns in the interior to migrate to the capital, Luanda, in search of safety, even if it meant living in social vulnerability. We need to draw some analytical conclusions from this evidence. There are many Angolas in Luanda's history that are mingled in disruptive memories, as well as there are distinct rhythms of times and meanings in every single region of the country. And obviously, each one needs to be carefully scrutinized. Let me then return to the metaphor of the puzzle, which complements but does not replace the image of the palimpsest. If the palimpsest helps us grasp the temporal layering of Angola's history, the puzzle compels us to confront its spatial, cultural, and epistemic fragmentation. A puzzle is never complete. It contains pieces that do not seem to belong together, pieces that are missing, and pieces that appear duplicated because they have been narrated, remembered, and archived in conflicting ways. Consider Angola 50 years after independence is to accept that we are constantly working with a puzzle whose shapes change whenever we think we have fixed them. The borders drawn by the Berlin Conference do not match the internal political geographies of the Ovimbundu, Ambundu, or Kwanyama people. The memories of the liberation struggles do not fully align with the experience of those who lived in the Musekes, on plantations, or in exile. The post-war rebuilding of Luanda in the 20th century does not erase the long shadows of colonial segregation, nor does contemporary oil-driven urban ambition resolve the deep inequalities inscribed in space. And yet, despite this fragmentation, Angola persists, not as a continuous mosaic, but as a dynamic, negotiated composition, constantly reassembled by political actors, community, writers, and historians. To recall one of Walter Benjamin's lessons, each generation has the right to rearrange all the pieces, exploring new configurations, discarding inherited certainties, and adding fragments previously excluded or silenced. This is not a weakness. This does not threaten this country's unity. To take place seriously is to take the puzzle seriously is to reject the illusion of a single authoritative narrative. It is to address the tension between pieces that do not immediately fit and to recognize gaps and absences. Discontinuities are themselves part of historical experience. Angola's history does not become coherent by force. It becomes meaningful through interpretative openness, through debate, and the courage to accept ambiguity. 50 years after independence, history is not a closed book, but a field of ongoing reconstruction. The task before us is not to offer definitive answers, but to cultivate the intellectual patience required to assemble, disassemble, and reassemble the puzzle again and again. In doing so, we honor the multiplicity of Angola's past and the possibility of more inclusive futures. If the palimpsests remind us that the past is never entirely erased, the puzzle reminds us that the future is never fully determined. Between the two, we find the historian's responsibility to illuminate the layers, to interpret the fragments, and to create, with care and rigor, the conditions for the new meanings to emerge. Thank you.